All right, guys, so this video is going to cover our next two slides. So it's going to cover slides 4 and 5, So keep that in mind when you're trying to align the videos with the slides. So let's, again, some of this is a bit of a review and some of it I've added from prior classes. But I want to make sure that we're thinking about the same things and we understand the criteria for exercise dependence that have been proposed in the literature. This comes from Cook and Look over there. No, I'm pointing words again. This review or summary of exercise dependence proposed criteria comes from an article published by Cook and Luke. It was a review article summarizing the current state of exercise dependence in the clinical field. So remember, exercise dependence is defined as exercise-specific attitudes. So there's a cognitive piece and behaviors. There's a behavioral piece resulting in physical, psychological, and or social detriments. And that was from the prior slide, the definition I want you to work with as we talk about this topic and finish it up today. Exercise dependence represents the APA, American Psychological Association's 2013 diagnostic criteria for substance dependence applied to define pathological exercise. So you may remember when I first started talking about this in a previous class, I told you of the various proposals that were made for diagnosing exercise dependence, the one that actually went through for the task force for consideration for DSM-5 applied pretty closely the current diagnostic criteria for substance use disorders to exercise. And that came with it some controversies that I spoke about in a prior class, right? So individuals with exercise dependence display a combination of tolerance and withdrawal. So remember, you can see that's the attempt to apply substance use criteria to exercise behavioral addiction, right? So increased exercise amounts over time do not result in similar consequences in a variety of forms that we'll talk about later in this class. So the person has to continue to up, right, his or her exercise engagement. So whereas they might have started out with 3 times a week, they're not getting the psychological, emotional, physical, etc. consequences that they're seeking. So then they up it to 4, then to 5, then to 6, and then they start doing it to the point where it's detrimental to their lives in multiple forms that we'll get to later. Withdrawal effects occur when exercise is not undertaken. So remember from a prior class, I started to talk about that. These are adverse consequences, either psychologically, emotionally, physically, etc., just like with drug addiction, where if people can't exercise, they begin to feel these symptoms that are aversive and they want to eradicate them. Maybe they get depressed, maybe they get irritable, right? Maybe they feel fatigued, etc., etc. Next criteria that aligns substance use disorders with exercise dependence: continuing the exercise behavior despite persistent physical problems such as joint damage, okay? For example, not sleeping enough, muscle tears. Next, a lack of control in reducing exercise intensity. So, even if the person decides, you know what, I'm overdoing it, I'm overtraining, I'm causing physical damage to my body, I'm exhausted, next week I'm gonna go back to a reasonable amount of exercise. They can't. They find they're not able to cut back and control that behavior despite their hope to do so, their plan to do so, and despite some adverse consequences they're experiencing. Reductions in other activities, such as school or work behaviors because of exercise. So, people who are not getting their schoolwork done, they're not getting projects done on time, they're not studying for tests, for work, people who are not getting to work on time, or people who are not getting work done because they're exercising more and more and more and more. Next, excess time spent in exercise-related behaviors, meaning when they're not actually exercising, they're preparing for it, right? Or they're engaging in it. Or when they're not engaging in it, they're recovering from it. And this is obviously aligned with the criteria we talked about for substance use that you recall, I'm sure, from that discussion, right? When people aren't using drugs, Silas, stop! They're thinking about sorry guys, this dog is He's like a child, I swear. I love him, but he gets me crazy sometimes. So just like with drugs, when people aren't using, they're thinking, where can I get it? Where can I buy it? When can I use again? Here, people are thinking about what the next exercise they can try is and what they're going to do next time they're at the gym. And then they're engaging in it, just like people who use drugs instead of doing other things. And then when they're not exercising, they're recovering, like their body hurts, they have joint damage, they're tired, just like people who go through crashes after drug use periods. And then finally, the last criteria that was proposed for inclusion in the DSM, persistent intention resulting in habitually exercising longer than anticipated. So what that's about is, in other words, people are continuing to exercise far longer than they say they're going to once they get there. They're going and they're saying, this time I'm only going to exercise for an hour. And then they're there exercising for 3 hours, 4 hours. And they can't seem to break that excessive pattern. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide because like I said, this video covers slide 4 and 5. So we're going to do slide 5. 2 variants of exercise dependence. Now remember in the last video for class, I told you that there is primary exercise dependence and there is secondary exercise dependence, and these are often separated in the literature. Primary exercise dependence, solely exercising for the psychological gratification resulting from the exercise behavior itself. In other words, the exercise itself is the goal. Secondary exercise dependence means that the individuals who are engaging in excessive exercise are doing it to reach their actual ultimate goal. In other words, they're using the exercise to make it more likely to facilitate a more serious illness that they're trying to cope with, a serious psychiatric illness that they're trying to cope with, right? And that could be a mood regulation disorder like depression, affect regulation, but very often it is an eating disorder. So they're using the excessive exercise to facilitate the weight loss. And as you know from last class, people with eating disorders have an obsessive fear of becoming obese and gaining weight. And so secondary exercise dependence involves using exercise as a means to an end. And so the end state that they're using it for is to stay lean and prevent obesity that they fear so greatly. Okay, so the exercise is being used to facilitate what their actual primary objective is, which is weight loss, mood regulation, etc. So in this case, exercise dependence is secondary to their primary psychopathological state, such as an eating disorder or mood disorder, and the exercise dependence is actually exacerbating the symptoms of those other disorders, even though, ironically, people are trying to use the exercise to cope with that stuff, and it's exacerbating consequences related to the psychiatric illness. Because, of course, people are avoiding actually dealing with the illness symptoms themselves. They're not dealing with the cause of their depression, for example. They're not dealing with the problems associated with their eating disorders. They're using the exercise to facilitate regulating the symptoms of those disorders that are creating problems. So if it's excessive fear of obesity and eating disorders, well, then the exercise dependence is making it worse. It's actually harming their bodies more. They're actually losing more weight, etc., etc. Exercise dependence that is secondary to an eating disorder results in very severe consequences. Earlier eating disorder onset appears in people who begin to exercise excessively to control a fear of obesity. Lower BMI or body mass index, so it makes it easier for people to drop that weight to that dangerous level more quickly. Higher perfectionism is associated with exercise dependence that is being used to facilitate an eating disorder in some way. And you know a lot about perfectionism because I spend so much time talking about it. People who use exercise excess to try to facilitate their eating disorder, meaning to try to quell their fears of becoming obese, to try to lose weight more effectively, to try to purge, so to speak, or compensate for what they believe is eating too much, if we're talking about bulimia and a binge cycle, those folks tend to have more eating disorder symptoms than their counterparts who don't use exercise excess to do these things. They have higher, more prevalent obsessive thought patterns related to their eating disorder. So that obesity issue and fear of obesity is ruminating in their heads over and over again. They are more persistent in trying to fight this fear of obesity with these kinds of behaviors, and they have more ever-present anxiety. So as you can see, exercise dependence that is secondary to an eating disorder is typically associated with more severe eating disorder symptomology. Also, secondary exercise dependence in individuals with eating disorders seems to range between around 20% in individuals with bulimia who have purging behaviors that we talked about, where they have that excess intake of food, typically high fat, high sugar foods during the binge cycle, and then they're extremely guilty and anxious about having done so, and they want to get rid of it in some form. That begins the purge cycle. So about 20% in individuals with bulimia who are trying to purge and compensate for the binge, and as high as almost 55% of individuals with anorexia. Okay, so this is important to keep in mind, the prevalence rates in people with bulimia and anorexia of this secondary exercise dependence. Now, I will say, although the prevalence of exercise excess, exercise dependence in people with eating disorders has been shown by research to be relatively high, the existence of this concept of exercise dependence as secondary to an eating disorder is controversial and has been debated, and I'll come back to that in some ways later in class. So I'm going to end the video here. I know I was trying so hard to stay focused as my bed was moving around me and my dog was doing wacky things, and then he chased the cat off the bed. I apologize for the distractions, but these are the problems of trying to be a professor at home in real life, in my real room with my real peeps and my pets and so forth. So I'll catch you on the next slide.